Today I'm going to be talking about probabilistic symbolic execution, which is a quantitative program analysis that is the combination of symbolic execution with model counting techniques. This is work that was done by Jaco Heldenhuis, myself, Matt Dwyer, and Willem Visser. And the first thing that I want to do on behalf of the three of us is say thank you. It's a great honor to receive the ISSTA Test of Time Award for 2022 for the work that we did back in 2012 and earlier. I want to start by setting the stage with a little bit of a history lesson. So symbolic execution was invented in the 1970s, actually in the early 1970s, and by the mid-1970s people were trying to put it to use, for example, for test generation. By the end of the 70s, it turned out that most of the interest in applying symbolic execution to realistic programs had waned a bit because the lack of cost-effective constraint solving techniques. And that situation persisted throughout the 80s and throughout the early 90s. But by the end of the 1990s, what we saw was a steady increase in the capability of SAT solvers. They increased in terms of the size of formula that they could handle by several orders of magnitude. And then after the turn of the century, they became even better. And at that point, several researchers, including Willem Visser, published papers on how to perform symbolic execution for modern heap manipulating programs, and then how to apply symbolic execution in that setting for test generation. And that really kind of unleashed a pretty substantial amount of work in the 2000s on symbolic execution. So there were many technical advances in the symbolic execution technique itself. Many new tools came out, for example, CLE. And then there were many different applications of symbolic execution, not just test generation, but program proving and static detection of runtime errors and program repair and certain forms of numerical analysis and something called differential symbolic execution, which was a kind of a very precise diff, if you will. And our team played a role in a number of these advances. And this is kind of where our story begins in 2009. So we had a lot of experience with symbolic execution, and we brought that to a collaboration with some local colleagues who worked in the field of population ecology. I went to another building and saw a talk by a population ecologist. And I had always assumed that the way that they worked was that they modeled population level phenomena directly using, for example, partial differential equations. But what I heard about was something that was very different. It was an approach where the ecologists attempted to model with a degree of fidelity individual organisms, and then they used sets of individual models in combination, sort of interacting concurrently, if you will, to simulate population level phenomena. And what was very interesting about these so-called individual-based models is that they were built by composition of multiple underlying models. So these underlying models were capturing things at a kind of a micro scale, like the energy budgets for an organism, but also at a macro scale, like how the organism chose particular strategies for foraging for food. And if what I observed at the time was that essentially these ecologists were doing domain-specific software engineering. The domain-specific functions that they were building to reify these mathematical models were then integrated into a single composite model of an organism, whether it's a bee or a tree or what have you. And then this simulation of multiple instances of these organism models allowed a kind of in machina experiment to be conducted where environmental settings could be varied and population level phenomena could be studied. And so this was my first exposure to the idea that biologists were just programmers. And just to give you a super high level view of the complexity of these models, this is a more modern individual model that's actually customized to study the growth and development of tropical rainforests under environmental pressures, whether they're human or atmospheric or what have you. And you can kind of see in this model that there's quite a variety of sources of information coming in. You see the need for plants to photosynthesize, and that has to do with the amount of light that's available, and that has to do with the amount of global radiation. And then there's other issues like tree perspiration and the carbon dioxide emission of the plants and how that impacts tree growth. And then there's the issue of crowding on the tree floor and how that competition gives rise to issues that lead to tree mortality. And of course, that can also be impacted by human activity like logging. So the point is, these models are very complex and sophisticated. And let me give you a little bit more of a glimpse into one of them. So here's a particular model of female southern elephant seals that includes what's called a dynamic energy budget model. And it's about a little over 1,000 lines of non-comment lines of code in a agent-based modeling language called NetLogo. It consists of about 19 different functions. It incorporates low-level models from at least 4 different published papers, and one of those is this dynamic energy budget theory. And what goes on there is that there's a sort of an energy balance equation that's relating the energy intake for an organism and the energy expenditure, whether that expenditure is due to movement or reproduction or growth or bodily maintenance or what have you. And of course, the energy balance of an organism varies with developmental stage. And what was interesting about these models to me is that they were kind of described generically, but then they were configured based on experimental observation for each organism. So there was a kind of a tuning process so they got it just right. And of course, these scientists, like all scientists, understand that their mathematical models are imperfect characterizations of the organisms that they're studying. But one of the things, that I observed that was interesting was that the way that they abstracted uncertainty in these models was by using randomness. And you can see that here in a little excerpt of this model. So you see 3 different calls to random functions. You see random normal, that's of course drawing from a Gaussian. You see random, which is actually drawing uniformly from a range of integers. And then you see random float at the bottom, which is drawing again uniformly, but instead from floating point values. So 3 different, these models sometimes use a much richer collection of calls to essentially random samplers. So after a few months working with these ecologists, I asked a couple of simple questions. How do you tell if your models are correct? And their answer was, we run simulations. And so then I asked, how many simulations do you need to run? And the answer was, well, that depends. It depends on the number of parameters of the model. It depends on the number and the type of the sources of randomness and other factors. And so then I asked the question, well, how do you know when you've done enough, when you are ready to deploy your model and run these in machina experiments and then actually feel confident enough that you can draw conclusions from those experiments? And there was not a clear answer. And this, I don't mean this is a criticism of the scientists, because this is an extremely hard problem. I mean, these are actually high dimensional input spaces of these models, and with large numbers of random variables and lots of interaction amongst these these parameters, including the ones drawn from these random samples. But what this led to was a kind of an inspiration for the three of us. And the idea was that rather than accumulating confidence in an individual-based model from individual samples, which was what the ecologists were doing, instead what we wanted to try to do was accumulate confidence based on equivalence classes of samples. And we wanted to use symbolic execution to identify equivalence classes, and then we wanted to figure out somehow to compute confidence for equivalence classes, right? So that's the key idea. And we were really lucky that the Fulbright Foundation was willing to fund this project. And I got to visit the University of Stellenbosch in 2011. And of course, we're thankful also to the University of Stellenbosch for supporting this project. So let me give you a quick overview of what symbolic execution does, because then you'll be able to understand what probabilistic symbolic execution does. So we've sketched it here as a very simple recursive algorithm, and I've drawn your attention to this phi that's boxed in green here. This is what's called the path condition. The path condition stores a constraint on the input variables that permit the execution of a particular program path. And so the way that this works is when you call symbolic execute at a particular line or location in the program with a particular path condition phi and state of memory m, then the first while loop, what it does is it just simulates the execution of a sequence of statements by updating the memory and advancing the control location until it reaches a branch. And when it reaches a branch, what it does is it accesses the condition that's being tested in the branch and stores that in C. And then you see these two if statements towards the bottom. These are kind of dual cases, so I'll just explain one of them, and the other one is just the handling the negation of that case. So we take the condition and we conjoin it to the path condition. So we're asking, given the current feasibility constraint to reach the branch condition, if we take the positive branch outcome and conjoin that, is that satisfiable? In other words, is that condition outcome consistent with the current state of the program? And if the answer is yes, we recursively go off and perform symbolic execution for that path condition using the target of the branch. And then we perform the same calculation for the negation of the branch, except here, of course, we're using the negation of C. So that's symbolic execution in a nutshell. And if you take a program like this one, which is just the triangle program you've just probably seen before, and you run symbolic execution on it, you get a symbolic execution tree like this. And this is computed completely automatically. And what's nice about this symbolic execution tree is that it gives us 14 equivalence classes of inputs. Of course, that program can take any integer, any triple of integers. So the actual input domain is huge. Yet all of those inputs are classified into 14 different classes. So there's a substantial reduction in the sample space, if you will, if you're thinking about this in terms of the kinds of models that the IBM people were reasoning about. Moreover, symbolic execution gives us a logical description of those classes. And so now what we need is a way of computing the probability mass of each class. Essentially, we're going to replace SAT with model counting. Model counting refers to algorithmic approaches for computing the number of satisfying assignments of a formula, in this case, the path condition. Unfortunately, it really wasn't that easy. Model counting is much more expensive than SAT solving, and model counting for linear integer arithmetic requires convex constraints, and those don't arise naturally, it turns out, in real programs. So here's a sketch of the symbolic execution algorithm, and the extensions are shown here in yellow. So we add a new parameter p, which is the probability of executing a program path, the program path described by the path condition phi. And what you see here is that after we've computed the condition, we perform a slicing operation. So this decomposes the path condition into a set of path conditions that are dependent, or a path condition that's dependent just on C. And then we compute this probability P sub C. That's actually the conditional probability. And I'll explain why we do that in a minute. And then you can see that we've replaced the SAT tests with a test on whether the conditional probability is non-zero or less than 1. And another thing that you'll see here is that what we're passing as an argument to the recursive calls is the product of P, the incoming probability, and the conditional probability, or 1 minus the conditional probability. So what's going on here is that there are several key algorithmic features of probabilistic symbolic execution that we developed. The first was slicing the path condition, and this reduces the formula size, and that significantly reduces the cost of computing this probability. It also exposes opportunities for reusing computation later in symbolic execution. Calculation of the conditional probability requires that we perform model counting for the path condition, but we only have to do so once. Whereas what you saw before was that we called the SAT solver twice. Here we call the model counter once. That prob call is the model counting call. And this is because as soon as we know the conditional probability, we know whether the branch or the negation of the branch is satisfiable. Moreover, we can directly compute, infer the value of the off-branch probability. Finally, the kind of depth-first nature of symbolic execution ensures that the probability of this phi prime, this sliced path condition, will be reused during symbolic execution. So there's a lot of nice properties that result from these algorithmic features. Together, these allow us to compute path probabilities cost effectively. So here's what the probabilistic symbolic execution tree looks like for the example that I showed you. And there's a total of 29 branches. Only 8 of them required calling the model counter. 6 of these values could be reused, and 15 of them could be inferred because we calculated the ones on the off branch. So one point I want to emphasize is that engineering really matters here. We found that even for pretty well understood theories like linear integer arithmetic, model counting is expensive, but it's not dependent on the size of the variable domains, but rather the number of variables. If you think of model counting as a geometric problem, this is computing the volume of a convex polyhedron, and the number of variables is the dimensions of that polyhedron or polytope. And so that was a critical factor that we found slicing allowed us to target. We could significantly reduce the dimensionality of the problem. We could expose the recurrence of linear integer arithmetic constraints within the symbolic execution tree. And this was especially important in controlling the cost of non-convexity. Finally, the combination of these different algorithmic optimizations in the end allowed probabilistic symbolic execution to run on systems that were amenable to traditional symbolic execution. And that opened the way for other researchers to leverage these ideas, to build on them, and to apply them in ways that we hadn't anticipated.
This is Jaco Geldenhuys, and I want to add to what Matt said by talking a little bit about how others have used our work after the paper was published. So I'm just going to mention a few of the areas where it has been applied and developed, and I'll also give some examples, not necessarily meant to be exhaustive, but just an illustration of what has been done. So The first area is in the probabilistic analysis itself, how the probabilities are calculated. And many people have taken our idea and developed it further or proposed an entirely new approach. And one example of this is work by Marcelo Frias and some of us who have shown how to do model counting for complex data structures like trees and lists that are not necessarily that easy to enumerate. Another area that has been developed is the analysis of probabilistic programs in probabilistic programming languages. And we're very happy about this because it was the seed of the idea. One example is how to scale exact inference in this paper by Holson and others. And this issue of scale crops up frequently, and it's important because it is a technique, the symbolic execution part of it, that applies well to probabilistic programs. There are, of course, other approaches, but it's important to figure out how exactly to apply this to bigger and bigger programs, but I'll get back to that. Another area is fuzzing, and it is clearly very sensible to know what the most frequently visited parts of a program are, especially when you're fuzzing to direct inputs in that direction. And for example, Bertinger and others have published a paper called Deep Fuzz, which tries to trigger bugs in programs using probabilistic analysis. Then there is also a lot of work done on just testing and test generation. If we can determine which paths are the most likely, we can make sure that data are not overrepresented in a test suite. If we can find out which paths are least likely, we can generate inputs that will exercise those paths to find bugs that may not be as easy to find with, say, random manual testing. And lastly, there has been work, a lot of it by us, about reliability analysis, determining what the reliability of programs are, how often they fail, how often they are produce inconclusive results, and Antonio Filiari and others have published about this extensively and built on our tool, in fact. And then there are many other areas. I'm just going to mention a few, but there are applications to fairness analysis, analyzing smart contracts, and also in concolic execution to calculate the probabilities of paths. And lastly, in conclusion, I want to say that we're very happy about this paper and this award, and I'll reiterate that we're very honored to receive it. But one issue that crops up again and again is scale. Probabilistic symbolic execution works really well for small programs, but what do we do about big software systems? And this is something we have thought about, the compositionality, producing summaries, and I think to a large extent there is still a lot of room for improvement in this area. In fact, tackling the problem of scale and how costly it is to calculate probabilities, to do model counting, was one of the motivations for us to develop Green, which is a portfolio set solver that caches its results across a single run, across multiple runs, and across different programs. And that has all flowed out of this work. So once again, thank you very much for